Namaskar and a very warm welcome to you all. May I begin by inviting our three distinguished guests to come up onto the dais. Mrs. Thorat, Dr. Kerkar, and Dr. Firodia. A brief introduction to the Pune International Center for those of you who may not have heard about us as yet. Pune International Center is a think tank that was founded about 4 years ago by some very eminent Punekars who are renowned for their contribution to India's public life. We have as President Dr. Raghunath Mashelkar. We have as Vice President Dr. Vijay Kerkar, who is with us today. And the PIC wishes to act as a forum for open discussions and debates about issues of local, national and global concerns. In the past 4 years, we have had a series of events on various topics. We've had a lecture series, we've had this Chief Minister series, roundtable discussions, we've had policy papers on a wide range of issues, and we've had some very eminent speakers like His Excellency APJ Abdul Kalam. We have had Nandan Nilekani, P. Chidambaram, Veerappa Moily, Pratap Bhanu Mehta, to name just a few. Today's event is the inaugural lecture on a new lecture series that we are launching today, which is Empowerment Challenges. And to give us the inaugural lecture, we have Mrs. Usha Thorat with us. She's a distinguished banker and the former Deputy Chairman of the Reserve Bank of India. We also have with us Dr. Vijay Kerkar, who, as I mentioned, is the Vice President of the Pune International Center. He's a finance wizard. And we have Dr. Abhay Firodia, who's the Chairperson of the Force Motors, which is a pioneer in the automotive industry. I now request Dr. Kerkar to please take over and do the formal introductions.
Thank you, Lisa. Dr. Usha Thorat, our distinguished speaker this evening, Dr. Abhay Firodia, our trustee, and also will be chairing today's meeting. My fellow trustees and distinguished guests and friends. It's a really one of the most pleasurable responsibility this has given to me is to introduce Dr. Firodia and Dr. Usha Thorat. Dr. Usha Thorat is really one of the most distinguished banker of our country. She was Deputy Governor of the Reserve Bank, but she has served probably every department of Reserve Bank of India and every activity of central banking. And her contribution has been fundamental for country's well-being, because if you remember 2008 crisis, the financial crisis, global, India was one country which really remained unscathed. And I think a lot of training should go to then Governor Dr. Reddy and his colleagues like Dr. Usha Thorat. And I think it was a sort of world done so silently because the crisis did not occur, we didn't notice it. The reason we didn't notice is because their hard work and their high judgment, which they took on India and on the international domestic finance system. So I want to take the opportunity also to express my gratitude to her for that really contribution to our country in terms of saving our country from possible crisis. We also have fortunate to have today's chairman of today's conference, of today's lecture, Dr. Abhay Firodia. I'm in Pune, and I want to introduce Abhay to Pune audience, so I will not attempt, except for the fact that I also acknowledge he was, when Lisa mentioned about 4 years ago, we were trying to set up his organization. He was that time the chairman and president of Maharashtra Chamber of Commerce. And he offered very generously to even till we get our own campus to use that facilities of, and I'm really grateful to them. That really gave the impetus for what we did. And one word about this series, we have tried to every year introduce a couple of lecture series oriented towards issues. For instance, last year we started a lecture series on art and science of policymaking, which was essentially look at this being a policy think tank. We thought that's one area in which hopefully we can contribute to better understanding of processes and improve upon it. And then some of our colleagues felt that we are not really giving adequate attention to some of the equally important pressing problems country faces, which we sort of encapsulated under the rubric empowerment. Empowerment of it comes in challenges come in different forms, different areas, and the most important, if a hammer, all problems look like a nail. Me being the economist, to me all problems look like financial problems. So we thought the first empowerment financial issue is really empowerment, financial empowerment. And we couldn't think of anybody better person to talk about empowerment, financial empowerment than our distinguished speaker of today, Dr. Usha Thorat. We're going to have in this series lectures planned which will talk about power, problem empowerment at the local government sector. Also issues faced by many of marginal communities in India, the empowerment of marginal communities, and a few more. So we will try to get equally eminent speakers like this evenings for our other lectures. So I will not now stand between you and this evening. I request now Abhay to take over the proceedings.
Sharp eyes.
Dr. Firodia, Dr. Vijay Kelkar, trustees and members of the Pune International Center, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very grateful to Dr. Vijay Kelkar for giving me this privilege to be the inaugural speaker in the lecture series on empowerment at this prestigious Pune International Center. He's already conferred a doctorate on me, which I will not accept. I think this empowerment series is very fitting, considering that when you think of Pune, it is really a place which has given birth to and has nurtured so many great reformers, social reformers who really empowered, who really worked for empowerment. And I keep thinking, when you look at the names of Agarkar, Karve, Ranade, Phule, Pandita Ramabai, Savitri Phule, all the names which comes to mind, and the kind of work they did. Then you think, yes, social empowerment is really, really important. And then what happens? And why does it not happen? Then you suddenly realize that yes, economic empowerment is equally required. It's strange. So when I start off by thinking of financial empowerment, I think of, well, it's important to have economic empowerment and social empowerment. Without that, financial empowerment is not very meaningful. So I think it's a combination of developments that one really needs to make an individual truly empowered. So I think I have gone through your website and I'm quite impressed with the range of events that you have been holding and the variety of topics you have covered in the lecture series. In fact, I really like that science and art of policy making. To me, that really rings very familiar because in today's lecture, in a way, I'm really trying to, do that. Starting institutions like this is a huge challenge. I know I have started many institutions. And I even remember a study circle that I tried to start when I was, way back in 1990 or something like that. And just to keep it up and keep it going is really the challenge. So I think to maintain an institution like this continuously is the real challenge. And to keep it vibrant, maintaining the best in class quality. That's something that I think it's a challenge before you. But I also think it's a credit to the citizens of Pune, and no surprise either to me that the response to your center has been so good. Because I'm not very sure in how many cities in India you'll actually get an audience who want and listen to subjects such as the ones that you have been dealing with. So I think it really augurs well, both for the people who have started this center and for the citizens of Pune, that you have such an institution, which is not only an event manager, but it's also a think tank. I think that's an extremely important, and like I was pointed out, difference between you and the India International Center. So you go much beyond that. Before I embark on my topic for today, I just wanted to set out the context in which I have chosen this subject. I want to give you a little background of the belief system of policy makers in the 60s and the 70s, and a glimpse of RBI history in general and around financial empowerment in particular, to help you to understand how we have accurately approached the subject in the Reserve Bank. I've spent a lifetime in the Reserve Bank. I joined the Reserve Bank in 1972, soon after a master's in Delhi School of Economics and a year of teaching at the Lady Shri Ram College for Women. 19 years of my career were before the reform and 19 years of my career were after the reform. When we were in university in the late 60s and early 70s, the philosophy that most influenced us was the socialist one. The received wisdom those days was that the invisible hand could not just deliver an equitable society. State intervention in the economy was justified. Not only was it justified, but it was also necessary. Our theories on development were based on Morris Dobb, centralized planning models, and no doubt the Soviet influence on the policy thinkers of those days was quite significant. The professors were also similarly inclined. We had people like Amartya Sen, we had people like Sukumal Chakravarti, K.N. Raj, Naqvi, but there were a few like Jagdish Bhagwati who felt that the system would just deteriorate into a license Raj. And there was this famous Planning for Industrialization, I think Vijay would remember that book, which was a path-breaking book of those days. Most of us in college were inclined to either join the civil services or proceed abroad for higher studies. Entering the corporate world was not a preferred choice. Many highly intelligent students from Delhi University even joined the Naxalite movement. I joined the Reserve Bank as I felt here was an organization where I would get an opportunity to observe the economy directly from a macro perspective and where I could relate to my learning in university. The 1991 crisis, and today there's a lot of talk on the 25th anniversary of the crisis, and I find people like Mr. Kulkarni here, who was a star in 1991 during the crisis period. It completely changed India's strategy on economic policy. It completely transformed the Reserve Bank of India. I don't think many of us understand how much, the way we were functioning really got challenged in every department perhaps of the Reserve Bank. So what I have done in this, so what I would like to just do is look at the brief strategies on financial empowerment in both the pre-crisis period and the post-crisis period, and then go on to the lesson learned, and then maybe we discuss the prospects. Do feel free to interrupt me at any stage. This is not like one lecture. I would, be able to take those interruptions. So when we look at the history pre-1991, monetary policy, I don't think we had a monetary policy. The entire monetary policy was dictated by Dr. Vijay Kelkar. The government just borrowed from Reserve Bank, it borrowed from the banks. There was absolutely no chance to decide independently what money supply should be or what interest rates should be or anything like that. So you had your SLR, CRR, and almost entire financial savings of the public was given to government to finance its fiscal deficit. Whatever little bit was there left, and I think at one stage on an incremental basis, it was only 33% of total deposits that could actually be lent. And out of that, food credit took away some 10%, 40% priority sector lending took away. So 50% of 30%, some 15% was given to industry, private sector. So it was really a period of allocation of credit. All interest rates were determined. Right from the interest rate of the smallest loan to the biggest loan, everything was determined. Everything was fixed. Credit was allocated, we had a notorious credit authorization scheme. Everything had to be referred to the Reserve Bank. Today when we are talking about it, even when I'm writing about it, I can't even imagine that what it was. But we lived with that. I lived with that for 20 years. Allocation of credit, all interest rates were determined, all exchange rates was fixed, which meant that Reserve Bank stood to buy and sell at the rates announced by us. So when you change the rate, it was a devaluation. And always no upvaluation was always, and it was all possible because you had a very strict FERA, the horrendous draconian FERA of those days, where even for going abroad you had to get a P-form approval, and you maybe got $10 or $15 a day, and that was it. So very tight exchange controls. Overall economy also, there was huge amount of insulation, isolation, protectionism, and that is the economy. Banking regulation was important in 1969 because we had a plethora of commercial banks in the system, which the RBI really tried to consolidate. But after nationalization, practically control over banks moved. In development banking, yes, there was quite a lot of effort to expand branches after the nationalization of banks. So subsidy credit schemes were introduced, concessional rates of interest, new institutions, NABARD, AREC, all the institutions came, and it was, the whole approach was penetration of banking into the rural sectors, which both could be done by the nationalized banks and more particularly by the State Bank of India before nationalization, because it was in the public sector. So in the area of, but 1969 in a sense really represented our first efforts at financial inclusion, or financial empowerment, because that represented a very definitive step towards bringing the people who had hitherto no access to banking into the banking fold. It actually represented going and opening branches in the rural areas and the semi-urban areas and expanding the banking footprint in the country. So in that sense, it was very, very dynamic, forward-looking, and really a huge challenge for those days, and the banks really did it. There was a huge expansion in the banking footprint, in the outreach of banks, and in their directing their lending away from what they were doing earlier to basically large industry into the agriculture and the small scale sector and the self-employment sector. So, but this did go on, but it could not really sustain for very long. So in the 80s, towards the mid-80s, it was found that banks' profitability was completely not something that was looked at. Productivity was not something that was, efficiency, productivity, sustainability, these were all words which were just not relevant, not in the dictionary. And it's only when one realized that the banks are really bleeding that there was a period of consolidation. And there was a need to really have a very strong look at the banking sector. Even though, and what really sustained the confidence of the public in the banks was because it was public sector. And government stood behind every bank. So, in this, we then come to the post-1991 period, when I said things dramatically changed. The first thing that stopped was the Dr. Kelkar's borrowing from RBI automatically. It completely stopped. We stopped the issuing of the treasury bills, and RBI clearly did not have to fund the government's deficits. So this was, I would say, the most major step in the granting autonomy for monetary policy in the Reserve Bank. The second one was moving away from all those. A huge difference, and I'm sure Dr. Firudia might remember it. This was around 1991, I should say. The interest rate on government borrowing was something like 8%. That was fixed by the government, by the Reserve Bank, 7 to 8%. But private sector borrowed at 18 to 25%. There was a difference of 10 percentage points between what the rate at which government borrowed or at which food credit was given and the rate at which private sector got money. I mean, that is again an unthinkable kind of a spread. But that was the real effect of the financial system that we had in 1990. So to really tackle this, you've been reading a lot about the liberalization over the last few days in Indian Express, various other papers. I've been carrying all aspects of it. But lots of things that here is very interesting because what really happened was moving towards market determined interest rates for government borrowing itself released the pressure. Even though SLR continued, it certainly started getting reduced significantly. Both the CRR and SLR, we moved on to interest rates. One could actually use interest rates in monetary policy. Similarly, the abandonment of that exchange rate system and allowing the exchange rate to float with intervention. So initially we had a dual exchange rate system in 1992. 93 you moved to a unified market determined exchange rate system. So both these revolutionary measures in some ways for the Indian economy was something that really marked this crisis. So from moving from banking allocation of credit and interest rates to prudential regulation, which was really, again, prior to 1991, when banks used to charge interest in an account, they used to credit their profit and loss account, whether that interest was realized or not. That was the accepted accounting system. So you actually showed profits which didn't exist. You didn't know what the financial strength of the banking system was. So all this got changed after the 1991. So when you introduced banking regulation, it was really moving over to what is now well understood accounting norms, well understood prudential norms on capital adequacy, on provisioning, classifying a loan as an NPA or not an NPA. All these things really were put into place brick by brick, step by step in the 90s. We did, of course, and it was all done in a very gradual manner. I think that was the very significant aspect of the reform. Whether it was opening up the external sector, liberalizing the external sector, because after all, foreign equity opened up, foreign exchange markets opened up, the financial equity flows into the portfolio investment, foreign direct investment, trade and investment. I mean, all those areas opened up. So, but it was all done in a gradual manner, and the exchange controls which continued were really on the debt, overall borrowing that India was doing, and to a certain extent, certain sectors where foreign direct investment was perhaps not permitted. So I would say this whole period of reform really was one period where the steps that were taken were very, very gradual, but it was very definitive, and the ultimate target was very clearly known. What is it that you have to move towards? In rural banking area, again realizing that the method followed hitherto would not really work, one of the first things that really worked for inclusion, and I would say this was the next big move in India in terms of inclusion, was the self-help group movement. It started on a very, very voluntary basis. It started as some NGOs in Karnataka really promoting these women's groups for savings and loans, mutual help groups, where women, 15 to 20 women, would really pool their savings and then borrow from each other. They would set the interest rates, and they would also set the both on the savings and on the loans. And what NABARD did at that time was to then link the self-help group to a bank by getting the bank to open an account for the self-help group. This was a very far-reaching step, and it was during Dr. Rangarajan's time that this happened, because actually allowing an informal organization like a self-help group without any registration, neither under Societies Act, Trusts Act, Cooperatives Act, nothing. But it was recognized by an NGO and they were introduced to the bank. There was no KYC at that point of time. So this group could open an account, maintain an account, pool their savings, and the banks would I mean, the savings were safeguarded, and as the group started to increase their economic activities, the plans for whatever activities they wanted to finance were decided by them. It was very democratic, and they decided. And then the bank, depending on how they repaid, would increase their lending. If they didn't pay back, it was a group guarantee approach. They were all responsible. And that movement really grew. There was a very rigid process of first making the groups meet together regularly, every week, and then start with savings first. It wasn't loans first, it was savings first. 6 months after the banks were linked to the groups and the groups had done savings for 6 months, then only the first loan was done. And that really nurtured extremely cohesive, homogeneous groups which were democratic, maintained accounts, maintained their discipline, and this grew. The growth was quite significant. In fact, NABARD at that time, the leadership really took this program to, they gave support for nurturing groups. They gave support for developing the capacities. They gave support for building groups. Millions of self-help groups got formed. In the meantime, the government had been operating what was all of us who were there at that time called the IRDP, the Integrated Rural Development Program. Many of you who are district collectors would remember that program, the DCCs used to get. It's a subsidy cum credit program, which was again intended to empower people to follow self-employment activities. Now, when they found that these SHGs, the self-help groups, were becoming so, demonstratively so relevant, government decided that if the IRDP program was taken by a self-help group, the subsidy would be increased to 50%. Now that was the death knell of the self-help group movement in India. Because the minute the government announced a subsidy would be given to self-help groups, what happened was people just started forming groups for the sake of the groups. And very quickly they would take the loan and then disappear. The groups would just abandon. They would just disintegrate. Because 50% was just taken away and banks had to face the bad loans of 50%. So a perfectly good voluntary grassroots level movement where you were doing something for capacity development, for building entrepreneurs, for building talents, it just got completely destroyed by just making this applicable. And interestingly, when the individuals could take the loan under the IRDP, they got 3%. But when you got it in the self-help group, you got 50%. And that again pushed people towards forming groups for the sake of taking subsidies and disintegrating. So this means banks became very wary of giving to self-help groups. So they were really, they started reducing their exposure. But there was a huge amount of pressure from the government to do so, and then these loans used to get written off. This was the stage when microfinance started growing in India. And there were a lot of reasons for that. One was that the bank's extension of loans to the self-help groups had started tapering off. There were all these ready-made networks of self-help groups supported, like for example in the Kutumbashree, or in Andhra Pradesh you had the World Bank program for promoting self-help groups in the entire state, and they were all built into federations, and so you had all these self-help groups. So the microfinance movement could really have a ready network of membership which they could use. So they started lending to the members of the self-help groups, to the self-help groups themselves. Secondly, the RBI was registering these institutions as companies, as non-banking financial companies. Of course, the minimum amount of capital they had to raise was higher, but they managed to do it because in the NBFC sector, the foreign direct investment permitted was 100%, unlike in the banking sector. So, foreign private equity started investing in the microfinance sector. And the banks were also happy to lend to these microfinance companies, as their lending to these companies was also included in their priority sector. So, as a result of all this, there was an exponential growth of bank funding of microfinance companies of the self-help group, till it reached a stage when there was a huge amount of, I would say, both irresponsible lending and irresponsible borrowing,
because sometimes the loans as much as 4 lakh was given to a very small household for all kinds of dramatic, wedding expenses, all kinds of purposes which were, they could never be serviced by that household. And there was multiple lending. The same groups and people used to be taken to different microfinance companies and they all borrowed and they did multiple borrowing. Till such time as is usually the case, there were some floods in Kurnool and some drought in Andhra Pradesh and there was problems in recovering. Microfinance companies went after the borrowers, a couple of suicides, Andhra Pradesh government passed an ordinance and said stop payment. Overnight the microfinances kind of collapsed. But I'm getting ahead with my story, I should go back. This is now, we've reached almost 2009. When we look at financial inclusion in India, the original real start was in 2005. It was in the monetary policy of 2005 and the approach was not really the poor. It was the Aam Aadmi. It was to say, and I mean this is again a relatively recent story so all of us can relate to it easier. It was so difficult to get your maidservant a bank account. It was so difficult for you to get your driver a bank account. It was so difficult for you to get anybody in the unorganized sector with irregular cash flows with no document a bank account. So the approach was, how do you make a common man have an easy access to a bank account? It was as simple as that, which was actually quite difficult because if anybody walked into a bank, firstly there was a lot of hesitation to walk into the bank. And secondly, if you did, why do you want to open a bank account? Where did you go there? Where do you live? It was like endless questioning till the person was pushed out of the branch. So even though banks were in the public sector, even though they were, doing all the private sector, just the matter of rendering banking services to the Aam Aadmi is something that they were just not ready to do. So it was almost the movement in a sense came of, let us give a common man access. Let us make sure the banks provide the basic right, so to say, of a citizen, that there should be a bank account. And in the meantime, the September 1 took place in US and then, so naturally all this KYC, AML also started coming in. So we had to craft a simplified KYC policy for people with small value accounts. Just very small balances, very small credits, debits. So, and then with the biometric identification, this was before UID. Actually started with the biometric identification and handheld devices so that people could actually authenticate themselves. And an experiment started with the IDRBT in Hyderabad where the government of Andhra Pradesh adopted a technology-based solution using biometrics to transfer old age pensions to the people. I still remember this was in 2006 and the first results of that experiment went to this village and there were all these women with their cards, with their biometric cards, proudly showing it to us because that itself gave them a sense of empowerment. Just the fact of having an identity and having a bank account was something they were so proud of. So, this was again an eye-opener because very often you found that whatever you do from the supply side, unless you get the people in readiness to absorb it, you're not going to reach anywhere. So, after that, the story is a familiar one. Again, financial inclusion in India has not progressed the way it has done in Kenya or Philippines. And that's because of the fact that there it was basically a telecom-led effort, whereas in India it was a bank-led effort. So there was a difference in the way that we followed it here and followed it over there. Using agents again was a first time thing. 2006, for the first time banks were actually allowed to do branchless banking using agents, which till then you had to do banking activity only at a branch. But after that, you could do a banking activity of giving money, taking money, everything at an agent location. So if you find these SBI Tiny's and all these little, there are even today kiosks where you can do banking. Those are all through agency banking. So if I come to what are the really lessons learned from this whole experience, I would say financial inclusion cannot be seen as an anti-poverty program. It is an enabling thing. Obviously, education, health, skills and access to markets is extremely, extremely important. Plus, you do need fundamental infrastructure, and that way the UID was a path breaker. It was really important because that established that identity and the way to link accounts and link different programs. The other thing about financial inclusion, initially when banks are giving loans under financial inclusion, or the microfinance companies were, it was mostly for consumption smoothening and a lot for education and health, because most people wanted to fund, they were not able to get health and education from the government, from the state, what they wanted. So they borrowed and financed education, health and some housing needs, which means that they were really not generating. And it was because the economy was doing well, that overall economy, they were able to generate income and repay these loans. Otherwise, these loans by themselves would not generate immediately any return to be able to repay the bank loans. So, side by side with, in a way, what I'm trying to say is that giving loans for education and health in a way is substituting what the state ought to have been doing. And one should not therefore make a citizen indebted for something which the state ought to have been doing. So the access to markets similarly, and that involves all the connectivities, whether it's power, road, telecom, extremely important, because no financial access can be provided without the fundamental physical connectivity, telecom connectivity, because the whole thing is so IT based. If you really want to penetrate, it's extremely high technology based. So I would say it's an enabling program. It enables an individual to take charge of her or his life when other factors are giving that opportunity, but what you really need is finance and you don't get it. And when you need to do a remittance and you have to take enormous number of trips to the nearest bank, you have to spend a lot of time in doing that. The second lesson I would say is we should not push financial inclusion as a social or a charitable activity. It cannot be a non-viable activity. It has to be a self-sustaining activity. Only then it will be really sustained. And we cannot weaken banks by pushing this activity. This was our example of earlier. Weak financial institutions cannot deliver. RRBs and cooperatives, we have to go on recapitalizing them because they cannot deliver financial inclusion. So one cannot look upon financial inclusion as a social banking activity. The third is subsidies. See, it's not that subsidies are bad, but how do you use subsidies is the important thing. I think in all our experience where you use subsidies for developing local community-based organizations, village level institutions, capacities, training, skills, access to markets, it's good. But when you start using subsidies for giving it to a specific loan, then it gets misdirected. Today crop loans are given at 4%. Ask how many farmers are using those crop loans for agriculture. They probably, today because it's given for crop loans, they take that loan and do investment credit with that. Or they would do money lending with that. Subsidies will, it's just the natural way and it's very rational behavior. If I can borrow at 4% and lend higher than that, why would I not do it? I will fully take advantage of it. But is it being used for the purpose for which we say? We always say in India agriculture credit has grown, but agriculture production and productivity hasn't grown. What do you need to make agriculture product? And that's where the real anti-poverty will come from. Not from giving the loan at 4%. A person like even Professor Swaminathan, he advocates 4% is the interest rate that farmers should pay. Again, interest rates are not the only thing. It's also the adequacy and the quick availability, the prompt availability of finance. Plus all the costs, hidden costs. If you add up all the hidden costs, the fees you have to pay here and there, or the so-called fees you have to pay here and there, and the trips to the bank, and the loss of wages, and all other direct and indirect costs, it can come to huge amount, probably same as the money lender's interest rate. Because the farmer always, or the poor person, invariably will go to the informal sector. And that was another group on money lending legislation that we led, when we found that actually the 24/7 readiness to deal for the money lender was his biggest characteristic. And people, when you ask, what would you rather have, say I'd rather have a familiar person from whom I can go and borrow rather than somebody who we don't know whether that person will be there tomorrow or day after. So focusing on easy access, the usage and a suitable product. Again, one cannot make too complicated a product for the common person. It should be a product that he understands, she understands. Ensuring responsible finance. This is again very, very important. I mean, this lesson was the lesson of the crisis in the US, it's the lesson of consumer lending everywhere. Responsible borrowing and responsible lending calls for a lot of literacy. It also calls for more responsibility on the sellers because it cannot become a push product. You can market a product, but you cannot push a product. ULIP is a good example of a push product which was disastrous. Again, microfinance was also a good example which went to the excessive and then led to this distress. Balancing the costs and benefits of regulation. For a long time, we did not want to regulate the microfinance sector because we said it was a flexible, simple, close to the borrower. Too many regulations were not there, so it was much easier for people to access it. And as long as the banks were managing it as part of their credit risk portfolio, we felt that banks are lending to the microfinance, so you should take off the risk you are lending to them. So why should we get into the regulation of the microfinance companies? But then the Andhra Pradesh crisis taught us that no, you have to get in there as well, which is unfortunate because again, because the cost of regulation can be quite high. The cost of regulation, everyone would say it's what should really one be regulating? And then you start defining what is it that is a systemic issue. Like I said, if you are dealing with very small amount of loans, it may not be a systemic issue, but it deals with millions of people, it becomes a systemic issue. I am dealing with cooperative banks in Gujarat and regulating them, it's not a systemic issue for the rest of the country. But if I deal with the one cooperative bank in Gujarat and I do something to destabilize the confidence, then every cooperative bank will fall like dominoes. It will just all fall like pins. So there is a contagion effect there. Similarly, the microfinance crisis in Andhra Pradesh could have become contagious and affected the whole country. One had to contain it and bring a regulation around it and assure the government that this is not being. So there is this whole definition of financial systemic importance. Systemic importance, as the lessons came home to us, was not only dealing with large numbers or large systems, it also dealing with large number of people, where there could be a political issues involved. And also dealing with the big, and there, how do you deal with the big? Financial inclusion has to have some cushion against natural calamities as an integrated part. If we do write-offs periodically, that's not good for the financial inclusion or empowerment or any form of credit, because it erodes the credit culture. The people who have repaid their money feel punished. The people who have not paid feel encouraged. So it has all the wrong kind of incentives. So there has to be some sort of schemes, and we have evolved over the years many schemes, but I don't think we still have a proper agriculture loans risk fund in the sense of a credit guarantee which does not have a model reserve, where there is a contribution by the farmer and the banker to the government providing. I think that is extremely important, because otherwise natural calamities will just lead to waivers. And politically, every state can also announce its waivers and it can provide budgetary resources for that. One can say after all the money is coming back to the bank, but what happens to at the grassroots level, it just erodes credit culture completely. Shadow banking. Now shadow banking, what I have in mind is something like Sharda. Lots and lots of public funds being accessed by some companies who just grow. They start mushrooming. It's like a Ponzi game. Fresh money is being taken to repay old money, and in the meantime, monies are getting siphoned off and used somewhere else. So you have the Saharas, you had a lot of things of this kind, plantation companies. We've had a number of examples of this kind, but what was RBI's view? This is outside our regulatory jurisdiction. These are all state government issues. They are all regulated. These are not companies. These are not non-banking financial companies. Nobody knows what's a non-banking financial company. What is the definition? Because everybody, some finance company in the name means Reserve Bank thing. But there could be some small chit fund company here, there, some mutual benefit society, something. Everybody thinks, no, this is something that government is regulating. And then you have a celebrity endorsing that, and then it just grows. Television advertisements. How much money? Limousine. You must be heard of that one. How much people's money has been taken and squandered, and people have not got back their money. So wherever public funds are involved, and the Standing Committee on Finance, Sarvin Subbaram, he said that no, you can't escape RBI, SEBI, you cannot escape accountability. We don't care. It's not under your regulatory jurisdiction, it is not, we don't care. People's money has got lost, somewhere the regulator is responsible. So this is, there's no way, no defense. So the shadow banking, because when you bring more and more regulation into banking, things will get into the shadow banking space. So then again you have to be proportionate regulation. Because what is the objective of regulation? So I would say that is a very, the lessons of shadow banking are really something. That's informal banking is partly it, partly it's other kind of banking which the central bank can say, the SEBI can say it's not under it. So finally the ordinance had to be passed, and now SEBI is given the responsibility for regulating all such companies. Now it's an enormously onerous risk. I don't know how far we are equipped to even do it, but it has to be done. Financial education and financial literacy. This is really an important thing, and I don't think we are doing enough on this. Because it's easy to talk about financial. I would say every Jan Dhan Yojana product has to be accompanied by hand-holding. Today the accounts are open, but the usage is not what it ought to be. People have to use it. For that, people want to have hand-holding. You have to be made comfortable with using it. We have to use local languages. We have to use digital means to make people. How to operate an ATM, starting even with that. So I think the Jan Dhan Yojana is a wonderful program because of the outreach and its huge scale. But really we need to make sure that people use it. The other area where it's not directly financial empowerment, but certainly financial empowerment in the sense of consumer protection and consumer awareness, which is more affecting everybody, the common bank, average bank customer. What are your rights? Do you know what your rights are? What do you do when you feel you're unfairly treated by the bank? What do you feel when you think the bank has got onerous set of regulations and rules which really don't seem to serve the purpose? Now there is the whole set. I don't know how many of you who have a savings bank account have seen a code of commitment the bank is making to an ordinary account holder and what your rights are under that. And similarly, there is a code of commitment to the small borrower. These are things when, unless there is awareness and education of consumers, and unless there is a really something like what Mr. Pai of the All India Bank Depositors Association started, a really active consumer forum for ordinary people who use banking facility on a day-to-day basis. In this area, quite a lot of work was done by Mr. Tarapo, the former Deputy Governor who passed away earlier this year. Went into what should be the standard benchmarks of service. Set up a Codes and Standards Board of India, which is a Banking Codes and Standards Board of India. Unfortunately, we are not hearing enough about it now. And the Banking Ombudsman Scheme, which actually gets into the entire redressal mechanism for it. The main thing is, do you feel you're being unfairly treated? And it deals with everything including credit card complaints other than a sanction of a loan. Other than that, everything comes within the jurisdiction of the ombudsman. That because after all, banking is one of unequal contracts. The customer, the ordinary consumer is very differently placed when it comes to, the banker is clearly in a much more, the bargaining position is much higher. So I would say this is another area where education and empowerment have to go hand in hand with safer products. So the conclusion is that ultimately we are talking about access to finance. The objectives were same both in the pre-crisis and the post-crisis periods. The paths were different. We in India have experimented with it all. We've done branch expansion unmindful of cost. We've done directed lending. We've done cross-subsidized credit. We've done credit guarantees. We've done subsidy-linked credit schemes. We've experimented with different types of banks. And even today we are going into payments bank and small finance banks. We've operated the self-help group bank linkage program, microfinance, branchless banking, and development banks. The bottom line, I think, is financial stability, bank soundness and safety has to go hand in hand with financial inclusion. I think that's the real lesson as it comes home. And empowerment, to give you a small story. This was a visit I undertaken to Ajmer many years ago, about 10 years ago, where there was a NABARD self-help group which was working with some of these women in the villages near the Dargah, near Ajmer. And they were trying to persuade these women to form self-help groups and engage in some economic activity. One of the things which they were encouraging them to do was to make these crochet caps where people wear, for everybody wears when they go to the Dargah. Now, initially the women were quite enthusiastic, but their men folk were not willing to allow them to come out of their houses. So these were all Muslim women, and there were 2 years of drought in Rajasthan, and at that time I remember there were soup kitchens and other programs the government had to do. But that was when some of the self-help groups which started earning some cash flow from these sale of these caps. The men realized, and the women also, that here was something that would support them during the time when they would not have this kind of, when they would face this kind of severe shortage of food. So that turned the tide, and then the NGO supported by NABARD picked it up. And there was a lot of enthusiasm amongst the women. They actually started coming out, and 2-3 of them actually made it to Ajmer, where they sold directly outside the Dargah, the caps. And then they would go and buy yarn together. It empowered them in various ways. One is that whole exposure by coming out, and then they started encouraging their children, their girl children, to study. They themselves got very much interested in adult literacy program, which till then was not taking off. Some of them would go to Jaipur to procure better prices. One of them told me that I want to learn computers so that I can know, we can handle our accounts on the computer. And then there was some program they arranged with interaction with the Kutch, Seva and all that. And they learned a lot from those women. So the whole empowerment process really multiplies. And I would say that really becomes economic empowerment, social empowerment, gender empowerment, every way. And it started off with this small self-help group that was set up. Similar experience I had in Hyderabad also. There was a group of self-help groups. Women, they were sent to Lucknow because Andhra Pradesh had shown the lead. So they were sent to Lucknow, where they were interacting with some other groups there just to show them what you should be doing. And interesting, the first thing these people went and talked to they were curious was about family planning, not about economic activity or anything else. And then of course the interactions grew between them, because when the women become leaders and they are able to explain, they are able to stand and confidently talk, there's something that changes. And I think that is the kind of vision we have. I feel we have let go a very, very strong movement that we had in the form of self-help group. Maybe we are resurrecting it through the National Rural Livelihood Mission. But again, if it's a top-down thing, it kind of becomes counterproductive. But I don't know how we can capture the dynamism of this activity without and give it state support for it to become a truly empowering. But like I said, whether it is in the 19th century early social reformers or the 20th century financial inclusion, you can't really have anything really significantly happening unless there's an overall macroeconomic environment of steady, non-inflationary economic growth. I think that is an underlying must, because that is what generates the extra ability to be able to take you out of your poverty levels. And thank you.
We will take some questions if you have any.
One issue which I wanted to ask, and this is what we've been trying to develop also through the chamber, is one aspect of banking is basically securitization. If you have assets, if you have an opportunity to create security, then all the other processes become a lot more easier. We have had schemes like this CGTI MSC, which effectively did not work. I mean, we've had people talking about, yeah, it did, but it did. We've had examples, and we got people from Italy who came and described how the automotive industry has jointly created a completely new group securitization, where an OEM would securitize the assets out of the subcomponent guys, and then create a kind of security umbrella kind of thing, which then the banking system could take over. We've never seen any of these kind of things. And any idea why the focus has always been on lending and not on securitization?
Very good point, because in a sense I would say when the securitization market was developing in its early stages, and it's not that it was not there, many of the pioneers were like ICICI Bank and all that, who really securitized a lot of their assets, the receivables. And one of the incentives that was pushing securitization was the accounting treatment in the Western, which was actually a very misleading accounting treatment, because you could actually recognize the income instead of over the life of the asset, and you didn't amortize it. So the accounting treatment that we followed certainly was not the same as what was done, but in retrospect it turned out to be a much more prudent thing to do. The second problem, so this initially, I would say that this was when CRISIL had earlier, Ravi Kumar, was he? Ravi Mohan. Yeah, he was the person who really kind of, because the ratings and everything, they started giving these credit enhancements and, giving all these receivables. Mostly it was receivable securitization that was happening. I think then subsequently when started again, when, then the crisis happened, which really, in a way, securitization became the culprit there, because it created a lot of paper made on paper, the CPLOs and all those kind of instruments, which actually took away the merit of the underlying product, which is what we really need. Now again, there are efforts to do that through the factor and through the other various measures. In the middle, there was some drawback to the scheme because of the tax treatment. The PTCs were not, they were being sort of treated in a manner that was not exactly tax effective. So I think there have been a number of problems. Now I understand most of those problems have been taken care of. So really speaking, I'm really not sure what is it that is holding it back right now. And it is something that can be and should be explored, I would say, because it is a bundling and an unbundling of loan assets. It's even a sharing of exposures. Maybe it's something one can still look at. Thank you.
Given really nice overview for people who don't know the topic very well, from a retrospective perspective, could you share a few thoughts on where you think it could be from 5 to 10 years from now, and talk a little bit about...
Yeah, you're asking me to talk on this original subject, this prospect, and I really thought about that. I said I have not given enough time, then I thought it became too low. And the kind of popularity of the mobile. So I think what is going to be a game changer is the UPI. I don't know if any of you have seen, but I have seen in Tanzania they have this product on the phone for making remittances and for even taking a loan, which is very instantaneous. So I think in India we have actually lagged behind in mobile banking. And the reason for that is that the RBI insisted, and in this they had the support of the Ministry of home and finance, but not the Ministry of Telecom. Ministry of Telecom Affairs wanted to go ahead with allowing the telecom companies to provide banking facilities without the intervention of a bank account. Whether it was the basic banking account and the right to do money transfers. It had to go from a bank account to a bank account. The telecom could be the gateway on which you're doing it. But if you kept an account in the telecom company, then effectively the financial regulator will have to start regulating the telecom companies, and that had all sorts of other implications. If something went wrong with the telecom business, it would affect the banking business. So other countries have dealt with it by having a separate subsidy for banking and separate subsidy for telecom. So in one way, the Payments Bank is an evolution of the lessons that we have learned. So I would say going forward, I would say Payments Bank leading the mobile-based banking is a way forward. Payments Bank cannot make loans, but they can act as agent of an ICICI or HDFC, or a state bank. So it's possible for us to do that leapfrog into actual mobile banking using and it happens without internet connectivity. UPI, the beauty is just through SMS. Since very small internet penetration is there in India, I would say the way forward again is through just your telephone number. So I would say that's one big thing that which can happen. But I would again say that the way forward, we have to look at these linkages to markets and linkages, and the group, the community or the collective effort at marketing. That's an input.
What are your views on the basic idea of financial inclusion? That is the number of banks. I mean, I don't seem to know if many banks are open in say last 5 to 6 years. So what could be the reasons for it?
No, if you look at the data, public sector banks will do it in any way because they would be pushed into doing it. But the private sector banks, they have to have self-set targets with the Reserve Bank for financial inclusion. But if you look at the actual number of accounts, it's grown hugely.
I'm Dilip Bhatnagar. I'm deliberately being provocative, but can sound banking and sound politics go together?
It is a provocative question. But I think so. Because why the politician will realize that if you don't do that, over a period of time, just take the case of Ireland. The politicians had to really go down because they didn't do sound banking. How many times the GDP they had actually created their banking system, which when the losses came was enough to completely bring down the government and the banking system, which today also it hasn't survived. So I would say that it's like this inflation and growth. There's no trade-off. I think sound banking and sound politics have to go together, even if one doesn't think so.
The reason I ask the questions, is that after a long time, we have some idea now of how P.V. Narasimha Rao and Manmohan Singh were able to do a U-turn on many of the policies that happened earlier. And is there some lesson to be learned from that particular turnaround?
Yeah, I think the main lesson to be learned is you don't have to wait for a crisis.
That's
If you read Rakesh Mohan's interview day before yesterday, that the industrial policy was already got ready, and I know from Mr. Tarapur and others that the deregulation of interest rates, even the regulation of banks and supervision, everything was there. Mr. Kulkarni would share with you. I mean, it's all the technically professional people knew what is to be done. Did Dr. Rangarajan not know? Didn't all of them not know? They knew. But then why doesn't it get done? Even today we know what is to be done. But when we should not wait for a crisis, although the crisis is an opportunity.
I have
have two questions. On 8th of February this year, the figure of NPAs was almost 11 digits, and that was shown on the first page of Indian Express. 11, I think, digits it was. So, will that money ever come back to the bank? That's the first question. And the second is the irregularities which the customers face. One of the customers had to face it so badly that he had to be hospitalized. And ultimately, when the banking system was shown that it was faulty and it was not the customer's fault, they did not pay any money, and just going to the ombudsman at Bombay, nothing happened. He said, please pay the money. And the ICICI never paid the money. So in such circumstances, how do you suggest?
No, the second case, because it's an individual case and I think one has to take it up as an individual case. If you look at it as a system thing, then one needs much more figures and facts. And I think where the ombudsman has given an order and the bank has not implemented the order, then the consumer has the right to go to the appellate authority for redress, and I can help if you want.
Thank you very much.
The first case is a case where you're talking about the figure.
Yes,
11, I don't know how many digits the total credit of the banks are. Maybe 14 digits, I don't know, 15, I don't know. But the important thing is percentage. So, just after the crisis, when we started recognizing properly all our accounts, and then we came out of that. So, again, it's that will. See, what happened at that time, some 20,000 crores, I remember, was recapitalized, which I would remember. And in fact, government is sitting on good money on those equity which they put into the banks. It was a very small percentage of GDP, unlike many other countries. So I would say we have to get on with it. See, today we are in this NPA situation, no one, but we have to get on with it. Government has to put the money in. Where else are you going to get the money from? Not from Reserve Bank's balance sheet.
Has there ever been any sort of peer-to-peer lending in retrospect in the Indian system, or in prospect? Do you think that is going to be one of the major players in financial empowerment?
It's true that peer-to-peer lending or crowdfunding or various other ways in which one can even do maybe blockchain technology way of going towards reducing banks as intermediators between savers and lenders, borrowers. And that is something that definitely one can see it happening on the way forward. But again and again, the intermediaries who arrange for all this would have to be subject to fair amount of due diligence. Because it's easy to sell these products. I mean, one can say we can do crowdfunding, and many of the time, innovation has to go ahead of regulation. And there can be mistakes. But doesn't mean that you have to sort of address every situation and create a whole plethora of regulations that innovation happens. So I would say, yes, peer-to-peer lending. I think Reserve Bank has already come out with something on that. But it's basically something which has to, in the initial stages, just be monitored, watched over, but I wouldn't say regulated. But the lessons which I have indicated would be equally relevant for that. One should see how important it is becoming systemically, and then look at it to see where are the pitfalls, where are the risks, and then address those depending on the kind of people who are really taking those risks. If they are well informed, see, having an informed investor, which is what you'd expect a crowdfunder to do. But tomorrow a whole lot of illiterate people got lured into putting it there. Then tomorrow they would be asking the government and this, again the Standing Committee on Finance can call the Reserve Bank governor and say, no, sorry, we don't care.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you very much for taking this. I'd like to speak from there for a few minutes. Mr. Thorat, Kelkar, friends, I think we've had a very enlightening, very interesting, very, I would say, perceptive evaluation of how the Reserve Bank in particular and the financial system in general has functioned or not functioned to the satisfaction of our people over the last, let me say, 40 or 50 years. You went right back to 1969. And a glimpse into certain aspects of what the financial sector initiatives in the future, which are IT enabled, can do for empowering people. But what I was most struck by was your very politically correct statement, but very blunt message that to begin with, we created an environment for banking which did not lend itself to empowerment of the people, but it only lent itself to the empowerment of the powers that be. This is what I read between your sentences. And I think this is very important to accept. As Ghalib had said, कि हम खामखा चेहरा पहुंचते रहे जब धूल आईने पे थी. We are talking about what we can do to improve the financial system and how it can empower people. And fundamentally, we have been grappling with a politico-economic stance which has not been conducive to social development. It has been conducive to concentration of power. And I go back to a small booklet written by Gurudev Rabindranath Tagore after the Bengal famine. He gave a series of lectures in Calcutta which are printed as a book called Greater India. Very simple, very straightforward lectures. And in that he says that it rings so true today, that we look to the government, and in those days it was the British Raj, for resolving our problems. But throughout India's history, the government has never ever resolved any financial problems of our country. All problems have been addressed fundamentally by society's will to address them. And what happened, if I may be permitted to say so, based on what your address was, that we allowed this societal initiative to be usurped by the government. And we have allowed the government in our country to disempower citizens by appropriating citizens' resources into state coffers, by misusing them, by utilizing them in fancy conceptual things which never worked anywhere in the world. And then, when the things got out of hand, we have been praising the liberalization, the rationalization, the opening up of the economy. Why the dickens did we shut it in the first place? What was the necessity to do that? And it was purely a semantic aspect on the part of Nehru's ideology that laid the, let me say, stepping stones for his cohorts and his successors to follow, and gradually from 1960s onwards, or 1956 when the Industries Development Act came in, the country became less and less friendly to the common person, and it became more and more regulated by government fiat. All government institutions, as you pointed out very rightly, even the Reserve Bank, which is such a revered organization, was powerless to control fiscal deficits, to dictate the interest rate, to decide on the SLRs, which could be enforced. So our financial system failure and the failure to empower our people came from this fundamental error in putting too much power in the hands of the government. And the second aspect, which you mentioned in passing, is that nothing will work without governance. And governance means not making laws. Governance means implementing the laws that are available. And I venture to say that there is not a great inadequacy of regulations, but there is a great inadequacy of governance. So even if we were to not enact any further liberalizing laws or regulations to physically empower certain sections or position certain subsidies or do any particular micro level activity, we will still be able to make rapid progress provided we govern better. And I think financial empowerment retrospect is clear. The prospect, in my opinion, is going to depend, as you concluded in your last answer, to how well we govern in future, how our existing laws are implemented. Few examples, like take the property law. In India, in the last half a century, we have developed a great disdain for property. Property of the individual is not to be respected. Property of the state is to be flouted. If you look at all the footpaths in India, what are they? They are shops run by people who are supported by rentiers who are in the system. It is the police and the corporator and the local authorities which are collecting a rent. They are not permitting it to be done free. Just one street, the Ferguson College Road, Dilip and I, when we were in college, the Ferguson College Road was a nice place. You went for a walk in the evening. Today it is full of these pathariwalas. And I am told that many lakhs of rupees per month are being collected from them and are systematically distributed. So here is lack of governance, and it is everywhere, whether it is in public sector banks, whether it is in the ministries, whether it is in the corporators. The corporate India, on the other hand, is subjected to an increasing number of rules and regulations in terms of how you should behave. The recent implementation of the SEBI guidelines for the returns that the companies have to file and the changes in the company law are making corporate India much more process focused than result focused. And this does not augur well either for governance or for prosperity. So my humble submission is, having heard the very detailed insider's view that you gave us on how the Reserve Bank would work and how it would look at various issues for empowerment of people, I strongly feel that we have to call a spade, and we have to say the less government and more governance, the better it would be. Transparency is going to be crucial. Allowing private citizens into the system is going to be crucial, and you can only trust them if there is competition. These are, many of these words of like profit or competition have been anathema in our country. We have been state monopolists and we have been anti-capitalist. The world has moved in another direction. If you want financial empowerment of any section, weaker section, women, farmer, you have got to accept that they have to be viable. You have got to accept that there has to be more people-to-people contact. And nobody is really willing to do that, or was willing to do that till very recently. And I have no reservation in saying that this Sabka Saath, Sabka Vikas slogan is a far better slogan than Garibi Hatao or Roti Kapda Makan, which were merely slogans for usurping people's power into the hands of the state, whereas Sabka Saath, Sabka Vikas can lead to empowerment, can lead to financial inclusion, and can lead to better distribution of the prosperity of the country. So, having said that, I want to thank you very much for this very enlightening insight you have given, and thank you very much for listening to my concluding comments.
On behalf of the Pune International Center, we express a deep sense of gratitude to Mrs. Usha Thorat for this very engrossing and, as Dr. Firodia said, very insightful inaugural lecture. May I request Dr. Firodia to please present to Mrs. Thorat a small token of appreciation from the Pune International. Thank you to Dr. Firodia for agreeing to be chairperson of today's program. To Dr. Kelkar for being here. The Challenges of Empowerment lecture series is his brainchild. To the Pune International Center trustees and members, to the MCCIA team for their support, to Dr. Dilip Pargaonkar, who as chairperson of the programs committee of the PIC continues to guide us to present better events to you all, to the media for promoting this event, and to the PIC staff and team members who, under the very able leadership of Prashant Girbane, our honorary director, continue to work tirelessly to ensure the smooth functioning of our programs. A big thank you also to you for sparing your time to be with us today. Good evening. Thank you very much.